All right, thank you for joining us at the Homestead Museum. We are presenting Unreproved of Justice, the murder trial of Lastenia Abarta, 1881, a program that was previously given during our Curious Cases series some years ago. This story was brought to my attention more than a quarter century ago when I was a graduate student at Cal State Fullerton, working on a thesis that dealt with crime and the media in the 1870s. So I was dealing with incidents like the Chinese massacre of 1871 and the capture of Tiburcio Vasquez a few years later. So my graduate advisor suggested that I do some research and write an article on this Lastenia Abarta case for a publication called Journal of the West. That was way back in 2000. So we've been able to bring this to the public here at the Homestead in more recent years. And here we are once again doing this for our YouTube channel. So we're going to start by talking about some of the background of the people involved and actually more generally with women in the criminal justice system in 19th century Los Angeles. First of all, very unusual to see women as defendants in any kind of criminal case. Most of them were prostitution cases, selective in the sense that it was very periodic. Sometimes authorities would decide to go raid the Calle de los Negros, for example, an area of Los Angeles southeast of the plaza, and round up women prostitutes. They wouldn't arrest the male Johns, though, as part of that. And so you see those occasionally. Once in a while, there might be an assault or a theft case involving women defendants, murder being very, very rare to see. And that distinguishes in one of many ways the case of Lastenia Abarta in 1881 involving the killing of Francisco P. or Chico Forster. Forster came from a very privileged background. He was born in 1841, towards the end of the Mexican era of California. His father, John, was born in England, came to Los Angeles in the early 1830s. His mother was from the prominent Pico family. Isadora was the sister of Don Pio Pico, the last governor of Mexican California, Pio Pico being buried at our cemetery here at the Homestead. Another brother, Andres, was a hero of the California defense during the Mexican-American War as well. Now, Francisco, or Chico, was raised in the former Mission San Juan Capistrano and surrounding areas, lived on the Rancho Santa Margarita y Las Flores, which his family had owned during that period of time. So there's a term now, Nepo babies. He might be considered something like that, coming from a privileged background of wealth during that era. Now, this is the 1880 census, just before the incident we're talking about. You see the Forsters at the top of the screen. John, the father, is a stock raiser. His wife Isadora, and Francisco or Chico is the oldest of the children in the household. And you see him and a younger brother, as stock raisers. That was the family occupation during that era. But cattle raiser or hell raiser is another question to ask, because he was known for being very interested in horses. Now, that's a long-standing tradition in California families, raising horses, being expert at riding them, and horse racing was a big thing among the Californios as well. Chico was known to be a ladies' man also, never married, although he promised to marry somebody, which we'll get into very shortly. Lastenia Abarta was much younger, over 20 years, born in 1862 in Los Angeles. Her father, Pedro, was actually from the French Basque region and owned a saloon and pool hall in town. He also did some teamster work and some other occupations. This is the 1870 census probably, and it shows that Pedro keeps a saloon and has all of $200 in his possession. And yes, this is the 1870 census, come to think of it. The mother, Isabella Rada, was born in Mexico of Spanish parentage. Her first husband was a gentleman named William Monet, spelled money, an eccentric Scottish migrant to Los Angeles who had all kinds of interesting theories about the structure of the universe and other things. She left Monet to marry Pedro Abarta. The family was definitely a working class background, so very distinct from the Forsters, which brings up a point about the fact that there may be common ethnic characteristics among these people, but from the class perspective, totally different environments. Now, what Chico and Lastenia's situation was, according to testimony in her trial, Lastenia said she met him in the late 1870s at an event, and he immediately began pursuing her in terms of, well, in his mind, certain things, in her mind, different things. But the idea was that they had a relationship that was slow moving, Part of this is just the culture and what young women are allowed to do and not do. For example, he wanted a photograph taken with her, and she went to her mother to get permission for that. There would also be the question of having somebody present with you so that they can kind of watch over what's going on with dating and that sort of thing. But the idea was that Chico immediately pursued her, even though she wound up being engaged to a man named Francisco P. Ramirez, who was quite well known in Los Angeles. As a teenager, he started the first Spanish language newspaper, El Clamor Público, and later was an attorney in the Angel City. This, by the way, is the 1880 census for the Abarta family. Pedro had died by then, so Isabella was running the household. And you can see she has a large family with her, including Lastenia, whose name is spelled here Lastania. It's a common mistake or difference in rendering of her name. But the idea, again, is that working class family, very distinct from the Forsters. By the way, the chief of police was a next door neighbor. Now, what wound up happening was, as that Chico was pursuing Lastenia and calling on her regularly, as I said, having a photo taken with her, the question again of how in the Latino culture unmarried girls and women were allowed to do and that sort of thing, having chaperones, as I mentioned before. But eventually, Chico promised marriage to Lastenia. This is a very common thing. Breach of promise was also somewhat common in these days. And so it's the idea of a man promising marriage and then not following through. And at one point, Lastenia decides that, believing that Chico is going to be true to his word, she agrees to leave her household against her mother's wishes. And that's a very significant point to make, because it's about as clean a break as you can have in a family, to leave the household when the mother does not want you to do that. And what Lastenia and Chico do is they go to a place called the Moiso Mansion. It is a building on the right edge of the photograph, across from the Merced Theater and the Pico House Hotel. Those two buildings still standing on the east side of Main Street. The Moiso Mansion is basically the location today of the La Plaza Cultura y Artes Museum and Cultural Center. To the left side of the photograph is the historic Plaza, the center of Mexican and Spanish Los Angeles. Alvera Street will be off to the left. In the background, you can see a line towards the top there, and that will be the Los Angeles River. So what we're talking about is basically seduction. Chico takes her to the Moiso Mansion, continues to promise marriage to her, but leaves her alone for 2 long nights without following through. And this is an article from the 1881 newspapers talking about her testimony regarding what was happening, where she said that she asked him, "Are you going to marry me?" He told her yes, but he locked the door and took the key and then told her we are just the same as married. And she also testified that he told her, "You have stayed here at the Moiso Mansion all night and all day, and your reputation is gone, having left the house." He then told me if I would not come to bed with him, he would not marry me. She started crying, and he said, "It is best for you to come to bed with me, and if you do so, I will marry you sure tomorrow." I love Mr. Forster and was afraid he would not marry me if I did not do as he wanted me to do. So she finally consented. She stayed with him until morning, but he left at 2 a.m. on Sunday. When he left, he said he would send a hack driver named Reynolds to take her to the train, and she was to go to Tucson, Arizona, obviously a long distance from Los Angeles, where they would be married. So you get an indication of what the story is here, certainly from her side of things. Lastenia actually did return home during this period after she had left the household and was basically rejected by her mother. She then went out and bought a pistol, which she said in her testimony later that she intended to use to commit suicide. So there's a final confrontation. Again, on the left is more information from Lastenia about what took place. And basically, she and his sister, Hortensia, went looking for Chico Forster. So they went to a hotel called the Cosmopolitan, didn't find him there, and they went to the stable of Nick Covarrubias, who came from Santa Barbara originally. And when they got there, asked if Forster was at the stable, were told that he was, and he came out. Hortensia then came out of the hack, or the horse-driven carriage, it would be like a taxi, and asked him to get in, which he did. And then Hortensia asked him if he was going to marry Lastenia. The response, according to Lastenia's testimony, "Oh, yes, of course, I have promised her I'm going to marry her." He told the driver to take him to the church, whether that is the Plaza Church or the St. Vibiana's Cathedral on Main Street and 2nd, which had opened a few years prior, is not clear. But when they got to the church, Forster apparently told the driver to drive elsewhere, which they did. Then they got to Commercial Street, which is what you see in the photograph on the right. The view is basically from Main looking eastwards. At the end of the street is the depot for the railroad. On the right side is a 2-story building called the White House because of the finish of the building. So when the driver went up to Commercial Street, nothing was said then. Lastenia testified. Then she said, all I can remember was seeing Mr. Forster standing on the sidewalk. So obviously he had gotten out of the vehicle, and she heard a shot and somebody holding her, then being in the office of a justice of the peace named John J. Trafford, and finally in jail. So she testified at this point. She did not remember significant details of what happened. She concluded, I did not know that Forster was dead until the next day at 10 o'clock when Mr. Wells, this is G. Wiley Wells, her attorney, told her. And very significantly, I have always suffered from hysteria at certain times of the month. I'm going to jump back to 1865 because that last statement that she made has bearing on something that became an issue from time to time in the country. Mary Harris was a young woman from Iowa who shot an older man named Adoniram J. Burroughs in the building of the United States Treasury in Washington, D.C. at the end of January 1865, just before the end of the Civil War. What she told the court when she was tried for this shooting incident was that he had courted her from a young age in her hometown of Burlington, Iowa, continued to promise marriage even when she had moved to Chicago. There were rumors that there were improper relations between them. She said that Burroughs tried to take her to a house of ill fame. She bought a pistol, although she said she didn't know how to load it. Some of these details are very familiar when it comes to the Abarta case as well, including her own background. She said, my parents are Irish and were quite poor. She was 19 years old, about the same age as Abarta was. And so again, these details do sound quite familiar. And what she did is she confronted him in a hallway in the Treasury building. Burroughs saw her, turned, and started running the other direction. She fired a shot and missed. When he then turned to go down a hallway, she fired a second time and hit him, and he died very shortly afterwards. Harris was arrested and indicted for his murder. A headline here talking about the trial, including the middle part of it, Miss Harris insane about the time of Burroughs's marriage. That was another detail, was that he had promised marriage to her and then wound up marrying somebody else. And that's why she went to Washington and confronted him. But the medical testimony that was given concerned the insanity plea due to the effects of what they called dysmenorrhea. And that became known in recent years as the PMS defense. In other words, during a period, the effects of that on a woman could lead her to have the kinds of symptoms that could account for why an incident like the Harris shooting of Burroughs or the Abarta killing of Forster would happen. Now, Harris in the 1865 trial, which lasted about 2 weeks, very sensationalized in the Eastern press, was acquitted of murder, but she wound up being in an institution for close to 20 years. Going back to Abarta in 1881, it is notable to see some of the headlines in the press accounts, telegraph dispatches being sent across the country. So here's one that says a girl shoots her betrayer dead because, as it says here, she was seduced under promise of marriage. It also mentioned that Forster was connected with one of the oldest Spanish families. Abarta, too, was referred to as Spanish, even though she was part French and part Mexican of Spanish heritage. So the idea of Spanish as a European term was more preferable. But again, it's that he's a betrayer just after the incident happened. No determination made legally yet. Similarly, a wronged woman's revenge shot her betrayer and got his deserts. This is a particularly interesting one. The text is basically the same, but the headlines are different. And they all point to the fact that Forster was apparently a seducer and a betrayer and was had earned his death. Another one, A Spanish Girl's Vengeance. Sounds like a movie title from the early days of Hollywood. Bizarre enough, Western Pleasantries in this one came out of a San Francisco paper, but a dispatch that again had the same text as we saw before. Now you'll have a coroner's inquest, which is held immediately. And so they get a jury together of several people. They go to the crime scene. They investigate and interrogate witnesses. and what have you. On the left is a article from one of the local newspapers, probably the Los Angeles Herald, where it says that Lastenia Abarta, or Lastenia, the assassin, is a beautiful half French, half Spanish woman. Some attention being paid to her physical appearance, to her clothing, including at the trial. This is a common thing too, where that kind of attention to women is paid, but not usually to men. Talks about the fact, though, that a week or 10 days before, her mother received money from a married daughter living in Nevada to pay expenses for Lastenia and an older sister to go live with them. But Lastenia didn't want to do that. Another thing that was brought up in the paper as well was that the mother, Isabella, apparently had some fits of insanity during her past. That was contested by the family, but it seemed to be pointing to the idea that there might have been a genetic inheritance of some type. In any case, it goes into some of the detail about the killing. Now, Lastenia also had testimony on her behalf, but there was also some statements being made by others. So Nick Covarrubias, for example, who we saw earlier, was the owner of the stable where Forster was found by the two sisters. He said that he talked to Chico Forster about, have you got these 3 or 4 notes that she has written to you? When Chico answered no, why? Covarrubias said, those notes may be of great importance to you if she means to put you in trouble. The response from Chico was, well, it is very true, and there's one more letter at the post office. I'm going to go get it. Covarrubias then said, what do you think about this matter anyhow? To which Forster said, I'm beginning to think that this is a put-up job and that this girl came out in order that I should marry her. Basically insinuating there was some kind of blackmail going on there. When Covarrubias said, he told or asked Forster, Chico, have you promised this girl that you would marry her? The answer apparently was, no, Nick, I never did. The coroner's jury rendered a verdict that was pretty typical, that the deceased had come to his death from a pistol shot fired by Lastenia Abarta, but they didn't assign any blame on that because that was not their job to do. That would be for the Superior Court when she goes to trial there. That happens over the course of 3 days at the end of April 1881. A significant amount of coverage by the papers, lots of detail, including testimony information. One thing to point out here on the far left is that the jury is composed entirely of white men. And so we can see the names in the middle of the left column, Marion Miller, William White, et cetera. Thomas Gary is a name some people might know from Gary Avenue in Pomona. He was a founder of that community. The jury cautioned by the judge, who was Ignacio Sepulveda, very prominent Californio figure, one of the rare examples of Californios in positions of some responsibility during this era. And it's the usual thing about instructing the jury to not have conversations with anybody outside about the trial. At the bottom of that first column on the left, it points out what she's wearing. Again, that would be for women, you'd find that, but not usually for men. Neatly dressed in black and wearing a composed, modest demeanor, as she is accompanied by her attorneys and her mother and sister, also dressed in black near her. In the testimony, so Mary Moiso, who was the keeper of the mansion or the rooming house where Forster took Lastenia, gave her accounts. There was somebody else, Mary Roberts, who said that she was there at that point as well. One thing that Mary Roberts testified was that when she went there on Sunday morning, the bed indicated that more than one person had passed the night there, and the sheets were in places bloody. And that's for obvious reasons. On the right is more of Lastenia's testimony. She did have an interpreter. She spoke in Spanish in the court. Eulogio de Celis was a prominent Californio, actually, from a father who was from Spain. And so she is relating this through her interpreter, talking about the fact that she had her photograph taken and then going into some of the details about what happened with Forster, the promise of marriage and whatever. But at the bottom, which is quite interesting, when she talked about the fact that she was engaged to Francisco P. Ramirez, she said that Forster said to her, don't marry that black Indian. So that's an interesting commentary about people within a general ethnic group, but the differences there. So it's not just class, like between Forster and Abarta, it's also color of skin, Ramirez being darker, presumably, than Forster was. Very significant as well was the medical testimony by doctors who treated her for this condition of dysmenorrhea. And so Katie Wise said that he acted as her physician on a few occasions a few years prior to the incident we're talking about, that he treated her. She had pain in the head. Then he went to the jail 2 or 3 days after the killing of Forster. And he recorded that she had a high pulse, loss of appetite, pain in her head, and sleeplessness. And then he said she had been undoubtedly an innocent girl up to within a very few days. He also pointed out her mental condition, very irritable, changeable, that she had mental aberration due to the physical troubles from which she suffered, again, the dysmenorrhea. At the time of the shooting, undoubtedly nerves were entirely unstrung and she was irresponsible for the act. In the middle, Joseph Kurtz, another doctor who had treated her over a couple of year period, visited her in jail, and he had treated her prior because of a severe case of suppressed menses, is what he talked about. When he went to the jail on March 23rd, he found her nervous. She had not slept for a couple of days and said that he examined the defendant and found that she had recently ceased to be a virgin. The doctor went into some definitions of impulsive insanity and was using notes, as he was allowed by Judge Sepulveda to do, went into what cerebral disorders would involve and what have you. To the effect, the doctor said that what would happen with dysmenorrhea is that it would cause the mind and reason to be such that a person would be basically crazy, is how it was put in the newspaper. When a further case of supposition was put to a doctor about suicide, he said it would be natural to such a diseased brain to do so. As far as homicide, would it be a similar type of thing? And the doctor said yes. On the other hand, Joseph Hannon, who was a county physician, looked at things differently. He defined insanity, felt that divisions that existed were arbitrary. He said mania in some of its forms is the most common, and that homicidal mania was defined as in the books, and that no class of disease is more likely than another to cause insanity. He said that he never knew personally of any case of emotional insanity, and basically his conclusion was that there would not be an example, like he said at the bottom. No shooting alone would be evidence of insanity, but merely a single symptom to be considered with others. He also said the defendant did not seem to be insane to him when he saw her at the jail, and he gave her morphine to deal with her sleeplessness. Now, an important point to make is that almost certainly the courtroom was all male. There may have been women sitting in the pews or the benches as attendees, but that's probably unlikely because that would not be a typical thing to see women doing at that time. It would be considered to be part of etiquette. But the prosecutors, certainly the defense attorneys, the jury, the reporters would all be male. And did that have an effect on what happened here? This is a 3-day trial, which in those days wasn't particularly surprising. A lot of trials were very quick. The jury deliberations, however, were quite short. And so the response from the jury was not guilty. It was 35 minutes that the jury was deliberating. And so when the jury came out, it was a breathless silence, that this account said. The foreman read in a strong and clear voice, "We, the jury, in the case of the People versus Lastenia Abarta, as it was spelled, find the defendant not guilty by reason of insanity," which is an interesting way to put it. You would often have guilty by reason of insanity or just not guilty at all. But the words "not guilty by reason of insanity" are, in my mind, quite significant. At the words "not guilty," the account said, the dense mass in the courtroom yelled, cheered, and applauded in the wildest manner, rendering it impossible for the foreman to proceed further with the reading of the verdict until comparative silence was again secured. At that, the fair defendant, it said, leaning on the arms of her lawyer, quietly left the courtroom. And again, very importantly, the last sentence, the sympathy of the entire community has been in favor of the girl during the trial. Lastenia actually went to the authorities, chief of police, who was her former neighbor, probably, and asked for her pistol back. I'm not sure that she got it, but that was an interesting little tidbit as well. Headlines from other newspapers. Cheered by the crowd as she left the courtroom, vociferous cheers after the verdict of acquittal. Acquitted for killing her seducer. A popular verdict. So again, very clear indications that Lastenia had public sentiment on her side. On the left is an interesting short editorial about this, where a newspaper says, a local one, "It may seem somewhat singular that a murderer should excite so much sympathy upon being declared innocent of willful homicide. A greater crime, though, and one that could not be adequately punished by existing human life, was the one committed by him whose life has paid the penalty. A sudden death is not so greatly to be dreaded as the living death of a martyr to the greedy lust of man." Her whole existence is embittered by the deepest anguish and torture, and the divine mantle of charity gives way to the scorn of a selfish world. Very significant. Now, the upper right gets into some of the more common ways of expressing in newspapers that were sensationalized. The idea that Lastenia pulled a pistol from her side pocket and fired, sending the ball crushing into the brain above and between the eyes of Forster. And it said that people gathered around and some in the crowd said, served him right. Again, a very significant statement to be made. On the bottom right, talking again about the fact that she was abandoned. She grew desperate and followed him to his death by emptying a six-shooter into his worthless carcass. So far as we know, there was one bullet, but the worthless carcass is obviously a very interesting statement, as is the very end. During all the time of the trial, she had won the sympathy of the people, as she left the courthouse amid the cheers of the crowd who admired her heroism in avenging the greatest crime inflicted upon womankind. So it seems very clear again that the basis of the decision in her case could very well have been this idea that she was a wronged woman. Notably, in September 1881, several months after the trial, a fire occurred at the family residence, the Abarta residence. And this short statement in the top left says it was evidently the act of an incendiary, as the back door and window were saturated with coal oil. So who knows if these were friends or family of Forster who did this. There also might have been a copycat, which is not an uncommon thing as well. A young woman named Lena Young, who was, I think, from Germany, shot at a young man named Warren, who was an employee of an electric company. She was 17 years old. They became intimate, and under promise of marriage, she said he seduced her. She asked him repeatedly to make good on his promise, and then finding that she was to become a mother, she became desperate and sent for him. In the presence of her mother, she asked him to marry. He laughed in her face, she said. She seized him, but he threw her off and choked her and her mother, and then she drew a pistol and fired at him. So the details are quite a bit different, but some of them are reminiscent of the Abarta case. Early in 1883, Lastenia Abarta married Auguste Cazot, a Frenchman in Los Angeles who ran sheep outside of the city. He had a little bit of trouble with the law, as the bottom indicates in his life. But otherwise, Lastenia marries and lives a very different life. Going back to the Mary Harris story just briefly, she wound up, as I said earlier, living at insane asylums for almost 20 years. So the top image is of a asylum where you see actually there are many soldiers who are there, but Mary Harris appears on that list as well. She escaped at one point. There was also an interesting case of another similar event where a young woman named Lucy Horton tried to kill the son of a prominent senator from Alabama, Morgan. And again, it was because she said she had been cruelly persecuted in addition to being jilted by the man who promised to marry her. And this incident refers to and references the Mary Harris case from 1865 as well, saying that, in fact, Harris had just escaped from the insane asylum. Now, Harris wound up marrying her defense attorney in 1883. He died within a few years. The last that could be traced of her, at least from my side of it, was that she was in Washington, D.C. as late as 1901. Going back to Abarta and Auguste Cazot, they wound up staying a short time in Los Angeles and moved to El Paso, Texas, around 1885. El Paso, like Tucson, which was mentioned earlier, had a lot of common connections with Los Angeles, people moving back and forth between those two places, El Paso being a main entry point to and from Mexico as well. August wound up opening a butcher business, but he began to establish ties in Mexico, both business and political. And so there was a change in their circumstances. And the bottom is a letter from Ida Addis. Addis was the subject of one of our presentations some years ago, and her remarkable story and encounters with the criminal justice system. Addis lived in Chihuahua in northern Mexico and spent time in El Paso as well. So she actually reported from Mexico City at the end of 1886 that she came across at El Paso Lastenia Abarta, the woman who killed Chico Forster, among other people she wound up seeing when she was both in El Paso and Mexico City. Hortensia, the sister of Lastenia, who was her constant companion, in fact, spent nights in jail with her back in 1881 during that situation. She too moved to El Paso and married a prominent newspaper publisher. So the sisters resided together in the same city for quite a while in Texas as well. But around 1890, the Cazos wound up moving to the Mexican capital. August started out having a hack service, which is basically a horse-driven taxi. He had a stable. But over time, he built up his economic and political ties, was involved in a department store, a bank, an auto dealership. The family had several children born in Mexico's capital, and they lived in an area called Chapultepec, a very fashionable part of town. In later life, there was some intrigue during the Mexican Revolution, for example. There were some concerns about Cazo. On the bottom of the left side, it says a scout car, scout being a brand, helped in the escape from prison of Senor August Cazo, an American agent in Mexico who was condemned to be shot by the Madero government. This was the revolution that unseated Porfirio Diaz, the longtime president slash dictator of Mexico. In fact, Ignacio Sepulveda, the judge in the Abarta trial, lived in Mexico City and was a close advisor to Diaz for many years, and he had to flee and go back to Los Angeles after the revolution. So interesting references to this. The Cazos, though, did not leave during the revolution. They stayed. They, again, became pretty prominent. So there's some articles here that talk about inauguration parties for Mexican presidents and the visits from Hortensia, who was known as Mrs. Frank Wells Brown of El Paso, staying with her sister, Mrs. August Cazo, at their home during these major political events. Once in a while, you'd see references here in Los Angeles to the Abarta incident, the LA Times in 1900, for example, the LA Herald in 1905, and as well as the LA Times in 1937. So it was largely forgotten by most people, but occasionally brought out into the press. On the left, and that would probably be the Los Angeles Times account from 1900, there is an instant reference to a bundle of yellow old records at the courthouse. And these were probably the trial records, and who knows if those have survived. Hopefully they have, and if they have, they'd probably be at the Huntington Library now. But it says there was a piteous little note written on a scrap of paper in Spanish. It seems to tell the saddest story of the street. Underneath, the official interpreter has written the following, in other words, the interpretation of the note. From Forster to Lastenia, Miss Abarta, come quick. I am waiting for you for us to get married. Do not have any fear, Lastenia. Do not fail if you love me. And of course she did, and we know what happened afterwards. In that pile of yellow papers, which are going to be the trial file, is the verdict from the jury. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty by reason of insanity, as reported in that trial, which the LA Times noted was filled with sensation, and when the girl was set free, the courtroom broke into cheers. Lastenia lived to be 84 years old. She died at the end of January 1847 in Mexico City. Here is a copy of the death record for her. So she lived a very long life, raised a large family. The incident seemed to have been long forgotten, even after those newspaper articles from the early 20th century. But History.com has referred to the Abarta case. They've done that the last couple of years at this time of the month because that's when the incident took place. A long-standing series called Deadly Women featured this in one of their episodes. So you had reenactments with actors of the events, purported or real, that took place with the Abarta case. So that can be seen online. So if you check that out, Deadly Women, Lastenia Abarta, see if you enjoy that or not. Hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation about the Abarta case of 1880.